Welcome to the Cynthia Van Buren Lecture, Fall 2025. I'm Dr. Mark Cheatham. I'm the Heller Family Professor of History and Project Director for the Papers of Martin Van Buren here at Cumberland. We appreciate you coming out on this dreary night, but at least it's fall now, and we can look forward to cooler temperatures. I want to just make some introductory remarks, and then I'll introduce our speaker. For those of you who don't know, the Papers of Martin Van Buren have been at Cumberland University now for 10 years, officially for 9 years, but we started 10 years ago. We are in the process of digitizing and making accessible to the public for free the eighth President's Papers, Martin Van Buren. This is a joint effort, so I'm the project director, but we have two full-time editors, Dr. Andrew Wiley and Dr. Max Mathern, who are here on the front row. We have student workers, student interns who help us, assist us in transcribing. So some of them are here. Catherine Wright is here. Any other students who've worked on the project here? Thought I saw somebody else. But in any case, we try to have 3 student interns every semester work on the project as an opportunity to help contribute to scholarship, which is something that a lot of undergraduate students don't get to do. That's something that we really prioritize. I want to tell you that this lecture series actually began because of this woman, Cynthia Van Buren. Cynthia Van Buren was a Van Buren family descendant who we made contact with about 8 years ago, 7, 8 years ago, through her foundation, and our VP for advancement at the time went down and visited with her and had a great time. They were on a yacht in Tampa. Things happened. I never found out what exactly happened. But that relationship turned into an estate bequest when Cynthia Van Buren passed away suddenly in 2020. And so that estate bequest is what funds, in part, our student internships, but also this lecture series, which, again, happens twice a year. So in the spring semester, we typically have one of our editors give a talk about Martin Van Buren or their scholarship. And then in the fall semester, we have an outside speaker come in and present on their particular scholarship. So with that in mind, I want to introduce our speaker tonight. Dr. Thomas J. Balcerski is professor of history at Eastern Connecticut State University, where he's also director of the Center for Connecticut Studies. He's a graduate of Cornell, both BA and PhD. He also is editor of the Connecticut History Review, which is an academic journal in Connecticut. And he does a number of other things. You will see him frequently if you're in the area on news stations talking about American presidential politics and other things related to the U.S. presidency and politics. And he also is international. I saw a clip of him recently, I think on CBC. So that's international. We'll count that. So he's an accomplished scholar, an excellent teacher. He's been a great friend to our project. He is someone who, during the course of his research on his history of the Democratic Party, which is what his talk is a spin-off of tonight, he has gone to numerous archives, and he's been very generous in asking us and sending us documents that we needed. So we really appreciate him as a friend and as a colleague. After Dr. Balcerski gives his talk, we will have an opportunity for you to meet with him if you choose. There are books for sale. His first book, which is on the relationship between James Buchanan and William Rufus King, 2 19th century politicians, is for sale. If you're interested in that, you can come down and have him sign that and speak with him if you choose. We are just so proud to have Dr. Balcerski here, and so without further ado, please help me welcome Dr. Thomas Balcerski.
Thank you, Mark.
Yep.
Okay. I see it. Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay? All right, great. Wow, we have the first slide up. Let me start with a word about the title and the project that I'm going to speak about here. I titled my talk tonight, The Democracy and the Partisan Historians. Perhaps there's one or two from both on Mount Rushmore to think about. But Writing Party in the 19th Century United States is my subtitles. For those writing down every word, I know it's a wordy one, but I have more words to give you next, so hang on. Let me start with an opening question, almost a provocation. Who gets to write the history of the Democratic Party? It's a question I've been wondering about lately in our own era, where political history has enjoyed something of a renaissance. Popular biographies of presidents seem to come out daily, especially the ones behind me, while more focused individuals of the studies of the more than 12,500 individuals to have served in either the U.S. House of Representatives or the United States Senate continue to attract more scholarly studies. Studies of governors and cabinet officers, state legislatures, and mayors also have been trickling into public view, especially as their papers become more and more accessible, thanks to projects like the papers of Martin Van Buren. And yet, when it comes to party history, the history of political parties, and the partisans who compose them, two words to think about, the offerings are comparatively slim. And even then, more commonly emanating from political scientists, that other discipline down the road. For the Democratic Party, the literature has been maybe a book a decade, at least by my counting. So what accounts for this disconnect between this overflowing of popular political history and biography and the paucity of party history? Quite simply, I would say, a lack of sources. Quoting a future history professor and archivist back in 1951, his name was Donald McCoy, he writes, "Practically nothing has been preserved to document the internal growth and functioning of American political parties. The result has been," to quote another Democratic Party historian and a Mizzou professor back in the day, Robert Rutland, quote, "Trying to write a history of the Democratic Party is a task that has frightened away all but the foolhardy or the zealous." Well, color me both, I suppose, because here we go. The interpretive challenges are indeed daunting. And for me, they began with, as Dr. Cheatham mentioned, an interest in two particular Democrats in a particular time and place whose relationship fascinated me, James Buchanan and William Rufus King. But they also continue to the kinds of public history and political writing I've done. And yes, that includes opinion pieces for CNN, where at one time we were asked as historians to help rate and rank US presidents, an exercise I did for C-SPAN some years ago and continue to do when asked. I write for, well, more partisan publications as well. I have to say, this is something of a self-study tonight I'm talking about, partisan historians. This was one for the Bulwark I wrote about. And I've also participated in live streams on social media where I have an active presence and like to engage with the public there. The truth is that political history and the writing of political history is alive and well in places in this auditorium, but really and especially outside of it. That's one lesson I've come to learn by engaging with the public and audiences like this one. But I am also undertaking a big book project, probably too big to be honest, because it includes how many people? Let's do a quick count. Top row, Thomas Jefferson, upper left, yes? Okay. And then in the bottom, third row down, last Democratic president, Joe Biden. Perhaps that last one isn't too controversial. I think we all know Biden ran as a Democrat. But when it comes to Jefferson and some of those early guys, the historians in the room might say, no, wait a minute. Are we sure that Thomas Jefferson and Joe Biden are part of the same political project? Did they really think of themselves as Democrats? And we might ask today, especially in our own political environment, where history is a tool of partisanship to this day, whether the Democratic Party wants to see itself in that same light. So while I do have some research questions that have been guiding this project, I thought I might just kind of dive into one slide or two about the overall party structure to help to see if this makes sense to you, and you can help me in our Q&A to kind of dive deeper. sometimes old things are still good things, oldies but goodies, as they say. And for those who know political history and have seen something that looks like this map, you might be aware that the party system is a pretty well-established idea in the literature. This map goes back to 1880, when at that time, a political scientist and someone who I want to know more about as I study him, has produced here a diagram of the rise and fall of American political parties from 1789 to 1880. His name is Walter Houghton. And he decided to take a kind of metaphorical approach. He employed this idea of a river or a stream to represent the long, tortuous sometimes course of American politics through parties. Now, for the papers of Martin Van Buren, you've got at least half the project or more in his one lifetime, although this stream continues to this day in a second version of it. And indeed, the period between the so-called second party system, represented in the middle, and the third party system, represented a little further, is definitely the most tortuous of them all, with the most branches and rivulets and little side dead ends in some cases. So it's that period tonight where I'll be beginning in the second party system. And by the end of tonight's talk, I'll be well into the third party system, but retrospectively looking back at the first party system, where many historians of the party system go. So who are we going to do that through? Who is going to be our guide on this river of partisan politics? I would bet a man most of you have never heard of, and with a name that can be sometimes bedeviling to pronounce. His name is Nahum Capon. I'll refer to him as Capon most of the time. And yes, while I was touted as a historian of Connecticut, I do sometimes cross borders, and I found this guy in Massachusetts, which is next door. He was, in his most official role, the postmaster of Boston in the year 1859, a plumb partisan position, if you know how patronage works from one of your professors. And in this role, he helped to actually implement a number of changes to how the postal system worked in Boston that we now still rely on as innovations. So I'm going to try to, tonight in my talk, reconstruct the literary and political life of this somewhat odd-looking guy. Notice some of those Martin Van Buren mutton chops. There might be one commonality right there. Nahum Capon. I contend, as my argument, that partisan historians, of which this guy's one of them, specifically, molded the course of the democracy, and that was in my title too. It's a name that I want to say refers to the Democratic Party, not to confuse you. The democracy was one of those names that would refer to the party itself. So when I say democracy, I'm often referring to, i.e., the Democratic Party, and that's how they call themselves. But they molded the course of the democracy from about the 1840s through the 1880s, or from the second party system into the third party system, which is significant. I want to suggest that as a class, partisan historians influenced how the party understood itself in key ways. So I think this is a really important moment to reflect on how history has always been the stuff of contested terrain in American politics. Let's dive into it some more. Now, I did mention, as postmaster, Nahum Capon gave us some of the more interesting innovations that you now take for granted. Where would we be without that humble blue collection box that we see ubiquitously around corners and sidewalks? As it happens, the first version of it came in the city of Boston during Capon's time. And it was this system of free delivery of mail that was recommended later on to a more famous postmaster, Montgomery Blair. This was Lincoln's postmaster during the Civil War. And Congress actually passed free delivery during the Civil War for the first time. Americans had to put street addresses on their letters ever afterwards, and that is, in a way, all emanating from this idea that collection boxes could be the way to get the mail and not directly through post offices. Going back even before his time as postmaster, this young Nahum Capon in his early years was a lifelong resident of Dorchester, Massachusetts, which is just south of Boston. He began in 1842 to reside at his country estate. He called it Mount Ida. and it is today, again, the modern city of Dorchester. He went into publishing. His firm was Marsh, Capon, and Lyon. He had already, by the age of 19, get this, translated all of Plutarch's Lives from Latin to English. Impressive. He was an active and early petitioner of Congress to strengthen copyright law, a lifelong issue for him. And in his first act as publisher, he published the very first novel of an author you may have heard of. His name, Nathaniel Hawthorne. His novel, Fanshawe, which was later withdrawn, but it was that firm that gave Hawthorne his publishing break. Not a bad start for this guy. However, good starts don't always lead to good second steps, and I have to say we're about to take something of a dead end, and a kind of troubling one at that here. Yes, he was an intellectual genius. Yes, he was a visionary in some ways, but he also was deeply invested in what we now consider very much a pseudoscience, that of phrenology. Maybe a word you haven't heard, but as you can see from some of the images on the screen and from some of the, these are actual publications from Capon's work, he was a close and active supporter of a science that attempted to read, as it says here, the human mind by way of literally physical touching of the cranium or the skull. And this science, or pseudoscience, had troubling consequences even in its own day, but even worse, over time, it's been thought to contribute to this other pseudoscience, which unfortunately still persists, that of eugenics. Capon's firm published Phrenology in connection with the study of physiognomy, which is another pseudoscience, that of reading the face for defining characteristics. Things, again, that I hope and still believe are discredited. And we'll see that he will come back to this as a lifelong passion. This isn't just a one-off. This is a defining piece of who he is. Still, by 1845, he's moved away from phrenology and turned his attention to writing. And it's in this turn that his emergence as a partisan historian comes into effect, again, with the solidification of the second-party system. He publishes in 1848, The Republic of the United States of America. That's the title. Which was a post facto rationalization or defense of the presidential administration of James K. Polk. Tennessee connection for you. 1852, he publishes his next book. It's called The History of Democracy in the United States. These are some heavy titles, and they actually were very much meant to be broad and encompassing. This one was a defense of the Democratic Party broader than the Polk administration, going back all the way as he did to Thomas Jefferson. This last book was endorsed by the leading politicians of the day, including his chief patron and correspondent, someone I'd come across, James Buchanan. Capon also, incredibly, in this polymathic mind of his, found the time also to edit the nonpartisan annual compendium, the Massachusetts State Record, a kind of statistical abstract between the years 1847 and 1851. So within a 4 to 5 year period, I think he definitely hit his literary peak. Interesting, too, though, about this Capon character and about the kind of person that a partisan historian, I think, begins to represent. He's not one of the really rich guys, I would say, actually. Looking back on Boston's history and the history of New England, there certainly was a hierarchy at work. In Boston, this was known as the Elite 400, a group of families that could really trace their lineage back to the establishment of Boston in the Puritan era, and who by this time had established yet another terminology, Brahmin. They're known as the Boston Brahmins. That's not Capon. Capon is always sort of on the outside of this society. He interfaces with some of these folks, but he's literally in Dorchester over the line, and is always in a kind of pecuniary or financial strait. So it should be said, too, that there's no coincidence on the one hand that Boston is going to be the home to some of the most fervent abolitionists and anti-slavery activity, as well as, frankly, some of the most conservative, retrogressive thought out there. It's no coincidence, I argue, and I think this Athens of America deserves a deeper look for us. Another thing I found interesting is while Capon is trying to publish his phrenology texts, publish his histories, he's also trying to get into, of all things, documentary editing. And not the papers of Martin Van Buren, don't worry, he didn't try for that. He actually went for perhaps a bigger prize. He wanted to be the editor of Thomas Jefferson's papers. And I found correspondence that shows him actively petitioning Congress to award him this role. He doesn't get it, ends up staying within the Jefferson family. All told, during a lifetime of literary activism, political activism, and I would say pseudo-scientific activism, he published a very hefty list, of which this is not even the full, it's what fit on the slide, or oeuvre. But the thing I want to focus on, and the thing I want to kind of stress here as Capon as representative or exemplar, is his turn in the 1840s towards partisan historian, or history, I should say. It's also correspondent with a time in publishing and in the history of print literature of cheap, easily distributed material, pamphlets, often bound together, that allowed for parties to use this mass communication tactic to reach its membership. They called that not propaganda, but interestingly, education. And they saw that the work they were doing was educating the rank and file of a party. Capon engaged in this work after his period as postmaster during the Civil War. He became active during the election of 1864, again, now not trying to support the candidacy of a different Democrat. This would be General George McClellan, who ran against Lincoln that year, by contributing to an 800-page text that was called The Handbook of the Democracy for 1863 and 1864. Some of his writing went into it, but also he was an editor of this volume. And one of the things that he contributed was a letter that he had written during the 1850s against, at that point, an abolitionist response to what was still very much a controversial issue, that of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So I want to just kind of lay this out here, is he's still fighting battles during the Civil War about the antebellum. Always what he's doing is trying to historically sort of gain terrain to achieve party legitimacy in the present moment. In 1864, too, he's publishing letters to people across the whole nation, but particularly he's writing to people in New York, Philadelphia, pockets where there was actually very still strong pro-democratic sentiment, and places that certainly had been traditionally the strong spots of the party. And later, as he reflects on this Civil War period, he complains that his activities branded him what we still call, both in historical terms and at the time, his actions as being a copperhead, that being a pro-Southern, Northern sympathizer. And he complained in one quote to, again, the grandson of Thomas Jefferson, named Thomas Jefferson Randolph. He wrote, "During the war against the South, I was called a secessionist." Remember, he's a Boston. "Though I was denominated by an editor as, quote, the strongest Union man in the country because I expressed the opinion that the Union could not be destroyed." And that's another point I want to underscore. His Unionism comes right out of Jacksonianism. And it's that holdover, frankly, reaching back constantly as he does to both Jefferson and Jackson, that I think puts him out of step with the American people during the period of the Civil War, but that he will attempt to revive through his history writing. I find evidence of his later post-war thought emerging in a correspondence with this old guy, a little bit older than my book cover, James Buchanan, pictured here in 1863 in a lovely carte de visite, as they were called, the photographic technology of the time, courtesy this one of Lancaster History. He exchanged with Buchanan 97 letters between the years 1848 and 1867, a count that took me longer to make than it would have had I had a project or a database like the papers of Martin Van Buren to quickly count it for me. And we find in this correspondence something of a mutual admiration society between the two. For starters, Capon dedicated his 1848 book on the Polk administration. Reminder, Buchanan was Secretary of State and really an architect of the foreign policy of James K. Polk. He dedicated that book to James Buchanan. So when you put the dedication of a book to someone, especially a sitting elected official, you're really putting your stakes out there where you sit politically. Then, while Buchanan was minister to England during the 1850s, this is the Franklin Pierce administration, Buchanan was promoting Capen's work and trying to pull different strings with publishers and booksellers in the UK to get his books on the shelves. During Buchanan's run for the presidency in 1856, he published an anonymous pamphlet as an American citizen, as they often were, titled Plain Facts and Considerations Addressed to the People of the United States, a part of a growing campaign literature that by the 1850s was pretty commonplace. And in their correspondence over this, Buchanan says that he cannot officially endorse it, but that he found, quote, very little error with the piece. No surprise then, Buchanan's election to the presidency in 1856, Capen gets a plum patronage position, postmaster of the city of Boston. Not quite port collector, which we know, if you know patronage, you know is probably the job to get, but postmaster. After Buchanan's term in the White House, he's sort of exiled to Lancaster. He's persona non grata, frankly. He can't really leave Pennsylvania, and he doesn't. He had wished to go back to Washington. He never goes back. But he spends Buchanan does his wartime years writing his great defense of his administration, which famously is written in the third person, Mr. Buchanan's administration on the eve of rebellion. From what I can tell, Capen was actually one of the readers of a draft of that book. So you have someone is like a confidant of this former president here. And indeed, later on in life, I find, just like Capen attempted to try to edit the papers of Thomas Jefferson, he throws his name out to edit the papers of James Buchanan in the 1880s, but it goes to John B. Moore. So in these letters, I find, as I said, first an initial reluctance on Buchanan's part. I'm not sure if I can engage this or support this, to finally, by the end, an actual working collaboration between the two in their writings. And Capen will do some of the kind of digging during the war while Buchanan literally stuck in Lancaster into correspondence as well as into archives, I found. They complain, as they often do, about the current politics of the day, but it is to say that by the time on the eve of Buchanan's death, three or so years later, they're contemplating how the Democratic Party can, quote, get back to its founding principles. Always they're looking back to the past as the antidote for the present. So I think this is another interesting relationship. And frankly, just to kind of talk about the method for a minute, I missed this during the writing of my book on Buchanan, whose papers I think dwarf a couple times over those of Martin Van Buren, so you can hopefully forgive me. But by going back to them and looking again through a different lens, and by chance, frankly, I found this really fascinating relationship that helps to underscore my point tonight. Also, it must be said, besides the mutton chops and the underbeard, cool stuff, really cool handwriting too. And this is just one example of his flourish, of his C. You could imagine, you're in an archive, you're doing letter after letter, boring, 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 and then you see that handwriting. I have to say, truth be told, it's what attracted me initially. Who writes their name like that? Who does that kind of flourish? Someone with certainly a literary flair. I think that Nahum Capen saw himself by the 1870s as something of a Democratic kingmaker. I find him now not just corresponding with Buchanan and the old guard, but now every political candidate who had any serious chance of becoming president from 1868, 1872, 1876, 1880, and through 1884. At the same time, he is working on what he perceives will be his first volume of a multi-part series, also titled, again, and this is what's thrown me, Just the History of Democracy, which is the same title as his book from 20 years ago. So that threw me for a minute, but he literally was just revisiting the theme, expanding it, and hoping to prove, as he said, that the Democratic Party would, quote, arrest the fanaticism, selfishness, and corruption now so powerful. He really believed in the power of words. And in that way, what's interesting, he's not that different from some of the other moral crusaders of the times, the one we've spent more time, frankly, looking at, and whose words we study much more deeply, that of the abolitionists. Instead, though, you can see he's taking it from a much more partisan and conservative point of view. As far as his big book, The History of Democracy, he also felt that, again, it would educate the electorate and would certainly lead to the election of a Democrat in 1876. More or less, in every case, he was disappointed. While there were, after the publication of the book, many accolades, and while he was congratulated and lauded from people down to William Rosecrans, who was a Democrat, by the way, who found it very interesting, to Samuel Tilden, who ran for president and in a contested election lost to Rutherford B. Hayes, to, again, Democratic vice presidential candidates, to all across the nation. After that contested election of 1876, Capon is now into the 1880s. He's into definitely his old age now. And I find that he's starting to blur things. His later correspondence, he's not as interested in trying to decide whether his work is a historical work or a work of party history for the benefit of 1880s Democrats. Here he is writing now to the vice presidential nominee in the year 1880. He was an Indiana Democrat named William English. He wrote, of course, quote, I'm constantly engaged in completing the second and third volumes of the history of democracy, this big multi-volume set. But I have never permitted myself to neglect the current duties of an American citizen, i.e. continuing to contribute towards Democratic Party literature. He wrote, quote, the people are profoundly ignorant of the record of the Democratic Party. If I can complete the second and third volumes before another election, this would be 1884, we can command the victory. You can see he's fully believing in the idea that the party's history would be the antidote, and this point is now deep into the 19th century, for the party. Again, disappointment follows. He calls constantly for the return to the Democratic Party's founding principles. Here's another quote I wanted to share with you, writing to George Pendleton from Ohio, another perennial presidential candidate in the party. Quote, I believe the desertion of our government in its present popular form depends upon a return to the good old practices which prevailed so universally during the administrations of our three early Democratic presidents, his wording, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. And I pulled that out to also prove a kind of side quest I have, which is to say that despite some of the literature on the Democratic Party and despite our common understanding that this is a kind of party of Jackson and Van Buren, for Democrats of the 19th century, the founder of their party is Thomas Jefferson. And that is not just a rhetorical flourish or some passing thought. It was bedrock belief. And you see it when they keep invoking Jefferson constantly, to say nothing about how the party's platform through much of its early years was nothing more than a recitation of the Kentucky Resolves. Okay. I talk about a little bit here about how he interviewed Democratic Party national chairmen. I think that's another piece I wanted to stress here is how he engaged not just with candidates, like the politicians, but also the wire pullers, the financiers, and the national party apparatus. During this time, the National Democratic Party was mostly based out of New York City, which also positioned him very well to connect with them. However, I also find him in these years reaching out to numerous prominent ex-Confederate politicians. The most noteworthy, of course, would be the former president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis. And what I find here, too, is that there's this idea of reconciliation and of unification that historians write about happening sort of on the level of mass culture or popular culture that a little bit later. It's actually happening, at least among the partisans, earlier. So I think of this as a political strategy emerging that Northerners and Southerners realized that in order to find that reconciliation, they had to first find a common enemy. And here's Jefferson Davis writing to our guy named Capon, quote, I entirely agree with you that secession among us was, quote, a plant of New England growth. Now, mind you, he's quoting Capon in that moment. I don't have the letter, unfortunately, from Capon to Davis. That one doesn't survive, but he quoted that, plant of New England growth. That's Nahum Capon blaming New England, his own region, for the Civil War to the Confederate ex-president in that moment, creating that bond, finding common ground, and re-engaging someone, certainly, even in 1880, was completely persona non grata. A penchant, I think, of Capon's is to find politicians on the outs, to pull them back in, to get their ideas circulating again in different form. Maybe Davis wasn't going to be influential, but through Capon, his ideas flourished. I mentioned this multi-volume set. Fortunately or not, unfortunately or not, depending on which side we're taking, perhaps today, he never finished the 3-volume party history he projected, and volume 1 really ends before the American Revolution. So he didn't even comment in this final take on the current party system. But I did find it interesting that he was prefiguring party conflict, as historians were apt to do by that point in the Confederation Congress and even before in the kind of court parties of the colonial period. He says, quote, "The Congress, both before and after the adoption of the Articles of Confederation, had been the scene of many sharp and bitter personal collisions, which were characterized as exhibitions of party spirit and which involved questions which afterwards formed some of the prominent issues which divided the political parties of the Union." So for the partisan historians, they also read partisanship well before we even think of partisanship as being a prominent driver of American politics. Fascinating stuff. It's party spirit then, the thing Washington warned us about, the thing that the early framers were supposedly so antithetical to, that by the 1880s, partisan historians say, is actually an animating course of American history. And not just that, a good thing, as I'm trying to underscore. They believed in its value. I talked about phrenology earlier in this lecture, and I talked about how in his later years he would return to it. Indeed, if you remember from the earlier slide, his last publication is not volume 2, was not some piece on the Democratic Party or a history. It is an 1881 piece called Reminiscences of Dr. Spurzheim and George Combe, who was the Scottish lawyer who helped to popularize this. Again, it was a phrenology text. Now, by this time, phrenology was not nearly as current a pseudoscientific practice as it was in the 1830s. This was the beginning of the eugenics movement in America. Still for me to flesh out is the extent to which Capen's influence can be traced in these later eugenicists that come into the 20th century. The very last letter he wrote, in fact, was probably to Horatio King, Buchanan's Postmaster General, his old boss, you might say, another important historian of this period who we still look back to. He wrote, quote, this is Capen, his last words, you might say, "One thing is certain, quote, without the aid of the metaphysics of phrenology, you cannot explain the phenomenon of dreams." Eerie stuff for which to end a man's life who had spent so much of it trying to fight these two battles, that of phrenology and that of the democracy. I think as a class then I find, these partisan historians intellectually steered the Democratic Party like a captain holding the wheel of a ship by enabling the use of history as a political tool. That was his insight, frankly, that partisanship could be weaponized through history. The question for us, as we continue as historians to engage in the public sphere, as we continue to research and write political history, is have we really moved that far away from Nahum Capen? I think by tracing Capen's democratic involvements, that would be a capital D there. I hope this role, this continuing role, I would argue, of partisan historian in crafting both the events of the time and in writing the history that follow becomes clearer. To me, this is an unsettling picture. For as it had for more than 80 years, the Democratic Party and its various antecedents, remember that river, certainly have lifted the masses, kind of taking the kind of pro-Jacksonian take for a minute here. Mass participation in voting. This is, again, the era of mass democracy. Of course, at the expense of many other groups, women, people of color, indigenous people, and those who did not enjoy the suffrage during the 19th century. Partisan historians like Capen and his ilk, and there are many others I think we could talk about, and that's what I continue to research, is how broad a phenomena this is. Provided, yes, concrete tools in the form of campaign publications and philosophical explanations in the form of longer published works. They did so, I think, to maintain the supremacy of their political project in the United States. In an era, this era that we've been studying, that the papers of Martin Van Buren helps to illustrate, when the rights of the majority required the circumscription of the minority, Nahum Capen was in the vanguard of a project that I think was at once historical and political. His influence, moreover, lives on in ways seen and unseen to this day. Thank you.
So we have time for some questions. So we're going to have a second microphone that'll be out in the audience. And I will be manning that, so I'll come to you if you have a question. I will tell you, students, there are faculty and staff and administrators here who will probably want to ask questions, but I will prioritize you. So if you're a student and you want to ask a question, I'll come to you first before I go to them. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand. I'll be happy to come to you. So, Dr. Mathern. There you go. He's looking out for you first.
Hi, Tom. So I love this topic, and there's 10 things I could ask about, but I'm not going to give you guys that much time. So I'm going to stick with one long-winded question. And one of the real opportunities with this project is that you get to trace this man revising his thesis over the course of decades, keeping the title but changing the thesis. And what I want to ask about is whether or not his concept of the democracy's enemies evolved. And the context here for this is early on, the Jeffersonians and later the Jacksonians, when they talked about the purpose of their party, when they discussed the histories of their party, they discussed this eternal conflict between the democracy of the nation and the aristocracy of the nation. And they did not talk about the aristocracy as a loyal opposition that needed to be respected. They talked about it as an un-American scourge in the body politic that needed to be marginalized and broken at all costs. And yet, though, when you go into the 1850s and the antebellum era, memoirists especially are now looking back on that first and second party system with these rose-colored glasses saying, we didn't mean the things that we said about each other back then. We all got along. Do you see any of that development taking place with Capon, the way that he talks about the democracy's adversaries and their rivals? Does he come to see them as necessary, loyal opposition? Does he reign within the old Jacksonian camp, seeing them as an un-American evil? Is there any evolution in his thought that way?
Thank you for that question. Yes, I think this invocation of Jefferson, which is constant through his work and of founding principles, necessarily also parrots that same viewpoint, almost Manchian conflict of good and evil, that persists but in different form now with a different party, first the Whigs, where he begins as the opposition, but intensifies and becomes far more vitriolic when it's the Republican Party, and specifically over issues of civil rights. The most vitriolic, the most hateful, the most kind of black and white thinking, literally, comes over this issue in the Civil War and Reconstruction, where the party's platforms are simplified down to kind of bullets, literally. And for Capon, I think the period is the most painful as well. And it's the period where he, I think, goes the deepest philosophically into thinking that the cure is a return to founding principles of Jeffersonian ideas about, we would say, states' rights, of individual liberties, sort of classic liberalism in some ways, as we might talk about it. So I think it actually goes even deeper, whereas his party is taking a bit more of a reconciliationist view, necessarily. He doesn't have to play the political game anymore. He's sort of had his moment, he's politicked, now he's just angry and older, which is a trope, but he's both those things. You talk about campaign autobiographies and political memoir. I'd be remiss to say, I didn't get to talk about it here, that of course Martin Van Buren does the same thing. I've been talking with some of the editors and professors about this. Van Buren will write 2 that we know of surviving post-presidency memoirs or histories. One is a history, where he's mostly taking on the Federalist period, and he's right, sort of rewriting in a way that helps to kind of soften the later conflict, which in a way exculpates himself. And then his autobiography, both these things published posthumously. And while people like Buchanan and Van Buren are engaging in these projects for legacy, Capon doesn't have to think about that. He's not well known, he doesn't have the same reputation to hold, so he could be more zealous and more foolhardy, you might say, than his peers.
Any other questions? I'm going to walk toward President Stum, but if a student raises their hand, I will deviate from my path. Sorry, Catherine has her hand up, Dr. Stum. I will come back to you, though.
I always have a question. So as a man who lived through the contentious period of the Civil War and would have been invested in the politics of the time, was phrenology connected to his political ideology? Because I know, like, for chattel slavery, there's a lot of justification in racism, and phrenology as a justification for that. So I'm just curious if he ever wrote about that or discussed phrenology in connection to his politics.
No, it's an excellent question. One I've struggled to find direct connections. I would say it's not present in his correspondence, and it's not as clearly underscored even in the text that he published as publisher about phrenology from the 1830s. It's implicit, and it will be actually the work of others to make the more overtly racist arguments, I think, that come out of phrenology. He's not necessarily one of those people to do that work. He actually, I think, saw it more purely scientifically and did not, interestingly, take that as the weapon of which to wedge into the partisan battles. But I find it more than coincidental, and I've been trying to work out for myself this relationship, because it is, I think, also the case that most of the phrenologists and the phrenological thinkers and sort of proponents aligned with the democracy. That part I've been able to line up more so. So there is certainly there's sort of my science and your science a little bit, which I think, again, I kind of get behind this idea of facts for one group and facts for another. So that kind of made sense to me. I'm like, oh, I see. This is a way to underscore certain partisan ideas and certain notions that even if you're not actively promoting it, this idea of almost of a dog whistle, I think you're right. It's like it's there and it's beneath the surface for him, but I think absolutely.
Hi. Can you expand more on it sounds like he was kind of socially isolated from his peers in the Boston area and how that affected his politics, because it seems like he has more in common, with the agrarian South than he does with his neighbors. Can you kind of reflect on how that colored his view of history and current events?
No, absolutely. And I was going to respond earlier to the first question that part of it is that he is on the social sort of outside of Boston society, never really accepted as one, both economically does not have the funds for it, and literally, again, looking at the map of Metro Boston, today it's on the Red Line, Dorchester, but it is, by then, in the horse and buggy era, it's a bit of a drive out of town, and he is in a rural part of, what is today now suburban Boston. So I think you're right. I think it has something to do with sort of the periphery identifying with other outsiders, I might say. Buchanan, his great sort of patron and thinker, lived the same way. He lived in a plantation-style home, Wheatland, still around today in Lancaster, again on the outside of the city, whereas the city of Lancaster was moving in a fervent abolitionist direction. In fact, you need look no further than Thaddeus Stevens, the great abolitionist and civil rights champion, in his hometown. So in Lancaster, you have two great sort of opposing figures. For Boston, I find a ring of these conservatives literally ringing the city, whereas actually more of the fervent abolitionist types are downtown. It's people like Charles Sumner, it's William Lloyd Garrison, and that is part of it. It's, I think, a geographic split, which today we kind of think of as like the city and the country, but in the 19th century it was a bit more compressed of geography. And the landscape of New England, as I've come to learn living there and studying it, has these pockets. It's not one I know on the map that you might think, oh, it's just one. It's very divided. It's micro divisions based on rivers and valleys and natural geographic divides that, for a small region, really amplify, ironically, more than they might on a larger scale.
Dr. Balcerski, first, thank you for coming tonight. We appreciate that you're making the trek and sharing your thoughts with us. I have to admit that prior to tonight, I was completely unfamiliar with Nahum Capon. Yes. And the name Capon is an unusual name, at least to me. And I'm just curious, particularly for someone who's interested in phrenology and eugenics, did he have any offspring himself? I mean, are there any progeny? Are there any Capons today roaming the earth with whom you either have or might want to talk?
Good question. I'll take his line. He has a son, Bernard, who will help write, as often the second generation kind of did, his father's legacy. He wrote a family genealogy. I found an early 20th century Capon lineage. It is, Puritan stock in origin, English. But after Bernard, that next generation did not have children. Mount Ida gets sold. It's made into a park and housing today. So as far as I know, that line is no more. In the same way, ironically, so was Buchanan, a famous bachelor, as I talk about in my book. So no, it's interesting in that way that his project and his progeny do not live on. I have not come across Capons. I did do some Ancestry.com searching, which is another fun way you can engage with this stuff just to see. And I've not really even been able to find what might be kind of second and third lines. So it's a good one. It prompts me to look again and to see if there are connections to living Capon descendants. If there are, they might have the same philosophy that we see in descendant communities elsewhere, whose relatives they may not wish to associate with politically, but who knows what he would say, Capon would say if I presented him with tonight's talk.
Thank you.
Okay.
I was wondering if there was a significance when you said he considered himself a kingmaker. Was he kind of even an outsider in the party? And my second question, did I catch you correctly? He was able to petition Congress to try to get Jefferson's papers?
Yes.
Congress had that authority?
Yes, that's great questions. The second one, again, is perhaps more germane to our papers here. At that point, it was the Library of Congress that was going to be the repository for Jefferson's papers. So Congress outlaid the funding for it, as they still do, through appropriations to the Library of Congress to make purchases. Now, in these earlier days, these were actually legislative acts that had to be made. And these were also, in some ways, political. That's its own study about the history of Congress purchasing presidential and First Lady's papers. It was almost seen as a way to supplement the next generation before the era of a pension or any kind of support. Some presidents, as we've seen, even the ones in Tennessee, do not have wealth to lean on necessarily, and the next generation, typically it seems, does not end up doing well. But in the case of his playing kingmaker, that other one, I think he saw engaging with presidential papers projects as part of that. He got to shape the legacy of how a president is seen, and one as significant as Thomas Jefferson, by being editor. And as I've come to these last couple of days, get to talk with your outstanding professors, now that's something I think they're still doing. They are playing kingmaker of a different kind and making Van Buren wear the crown this time. And it's a harder task than maybe Jefferson, but I still think it's the same impulse in order to bring to light, to have your stamp. It comes from within, to do the hard work, and to bring to the public the national treasure that really would be a presidential papers project.
Other questions?
So I have two questions. Yes. You said, I'm a little bit unfamiliar with what eugenics is.
Okay.
Could you define that? And then also to clarify, you said that he was very is he credited as the person who created eugenics, or is he a big proprietor of that?
I don't have as clear an answer on the last one. I would say he is part of an earlier generation of thinkers who eugenicists lean on to develop their theory. So he's not in that same way, because this is a later 19th century, more early 20th century movement. It infiltrates probably in the popular imagination the greatest in the 1920s, if I could kind of pin it. I say this because for those of you who've read The Great Gatsby, another piece that's sometimes overlooked, Tom Buchanan, no, not that guy, James. Tom Buchanan spouts off some title, I'm forgetting his name, some reprehensible title, but he's like, have you read this guy's book? Very much by that point, it was like popular sort of history for that generation, for the 20s. But that meant that there had been several kind of iterations of this theory. So what it is, essentially, not the reading of skulls, not the reading of faces, it's the reading of bloodlines. It's something far more insidious. It's actually suggesting that breeding can be affected, and in so doing, bring about an improved version of the human race. Now, this is 1920s America. I'm talking about, we all know from our history classes what 1930s world history brings us, a much more sinister view that unfortunately leads to genocide. So I would say that that's the end kind of the flirtation of the American project with this as a mass movement, but it persists sadly in so many ways today.
So I want to ask the last question.
Sure.
are there any modern parallels to Capon? Are there people today who sort of fit the model of what he did, or have we moved past that either as historians or within the political parties today?
Thank you, Dr. Cheatham. I've been thinking about that too. And if this were its own project, and right now it's not, it's sort of fitting into my larger work on the democracy. But where do I start? I think it's Capon, though I didn't talk about it. Again, another former president ended up writing a history of the party system published much later, not that guy, his opponent in another way, John Quincy Adams. So it wasn't just Democrats who was doing this. The Whigs and the Republicans did it too. It seems like it was de rigueur for presidents to do this. So on the one hand, you had politicians, Benton, Van Buren, Adams, all engaging in the history writing project. On the other, guys like Capon, not at that level, are trying to do it more systematically. Again, we kind of would label it propaganda today. What happens to that, I do wonder. We were talking at our dinner yesterday about this, and I think for me, it goes through at least Woodrow Wilson, who is literally a trained PhD in American history, writing partisan history, leading towards his political rise, and rising through that to the ranks of governor of New Jersey. But as I was reminded, it goes as far as Harry Truman, writing literally about almost every US president and having some kind of historical assessment in a way that maybe was more personal for him and not meant to be a kind of project of telling history. But I think something does change in the 20th century, Dr. Cheatham, because there's no longer, I think, the place of sort of the politician historian. Words have to be more carefully measured. The candidates themselves become the campaigners. That's another change. And these kinds of projects are much more scholarly and time-consuming today. But it's not to say that partisan divisions don't exist within the academy, within our public sphere, and in our public institutions. They do. The question of how we measure them, how we handle them, how we continue to have productive dialogue, I think that's our challenge today.
Well, please join me in thanking Dr. Balcerski again. If you're interested in meeting him, purchasing one of his books, please come over to the table to my right and do that. If you're here and you haven't already signed in for credit for your class, there's a sheet of paper up here with a pen that you can sign. Thank you again for coming out tonight.